Welcome to SportsLit. I'm Neil Acharya.
And I am Nathan Sager.
Today our guest is Barrie Shepley, a preeminent driving force in building triathlon in Canada. He built it from the ground up, essentially, with the help of a few others. He joins us to discuss chasing greatness, stories of passion and perseverance in sport and in life. His memoir, from Balboa Press, released this past June. Imagine you could be there for the launch of a sport, shape it and watch it grow. Barrie Shepley got to do that with triathlon as a young man growing up in Harrow, Ontario.
All right, in Essex County, near Windsor, I think.
That's right. He dreamed. You got it, Nate. He geography for 200, please. He dreamed of becoming part of the Olympic movement after watching swimmer Alex Baumann set a world record en route to gold at LA 1984. He would eventually see the day when triathlon would be accepted into the program of the Summer Games, and prior to that, he would watch the sport blossom from literally nothing in Canada.
Indeed. We likely just came into this knowing Barrie Shepley is synonymous with triathlon due to what he's done in the last 20 years, commentating on the Summer Olympics, and where you know him as the fellow who coached Simon Whitfield, the inaugural men's triathlon gold medalist. Now, Neil, you and me, and Simon Whitfield, we all grew up in Kingston, so we knew about Simon Whitfield long before that Olympic gold medal in 2000 made him famous. But when he won, we were young adults, and we had no idea how much work goes into an athlete getting to that level and how much it took to get a new athletic discipline into the Olympics, at least in those days when the IOC wasn't desperate for anything that might make 24-year-olds watch. So we had no idea how sports people such as Barrie or the late great Les McDonald worked so hard to make it happen, to formalize the sport and grow it internationally. Like triathlon, which is, Kenny Powers once described as trying to be the best at exercising with, swimming, biking, and running. It could have easily stayed as some sort of subculture and not become institutional and with Olympics and world championships. But people such as Barrie Shepley and his contemporaries, loved the sport and saw that it deserved to have people hustling and advocating for it on that business and marketing side.
Well put, Nate. Institutional. It really feels like an institutional sport. So when you're researching the Olympics, people, I know I was surprised. I saw it happen, so I guess I wasn't as surprised as most people, but I think most people would be surprised to go back and say, oh, wow, this just became part of the Olympic program in the 21st century when it seems like it could have been part of the original Olympics in 1896. Mm-hmm. In some ways. Now, I don't know how bicycles were the technology behind bicycles at that time, but I think it probably could have been pretty close to one of the first Olympics. So back to Whitfield, he was part of Kids of Steel, and that was an organization Shepley founded to expose kids to triathlon. So he found, he was getting the right idea for the grassroots, and so he was sobbing sloppy tears, he says in his book, when Whitfield won gold, because he had that lived experience, and we talked about that in our last episode with John U. Bacon about people, having a lived experience, appreciating something a little more. So he had that lived experience of watching triathlon get to this point, watching Simon Whitfield from Kids of Steel, and then all of a sudden he's the first male triathlete to win gold. Now, going back to where this sport was in Canada, he calls triathlon in Canada in the 1980s like the Wild West. So when it comes to bootstrapping, a very popular term these days with that's associated with technology. Shepley is the textbook sports example. Here's a guy who used his dorm room at McMaster University as an office to organize races when he founded the Ontario Association of Triathletes. Remember, his association predates, so I mean, I guess it's needless to say, his association with the sport predates the formation of the International Triathletes Union, which was the governing body, and that you need that to make it an Olympic sport.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. You said, and it's here. This is one of those classic bet on yourself stories. Now, I usually, cast a Spockian eyebrow when I hear that term, because usually you find out somewhere down around the 8th paragraph, oh, by the way, the Bank of Mom and Dad, underwrote this huge gamble. But no, that's not the case for Barrie Shepley. I mean, he definitely tells a lot of stories about, having to live on a survival budget in the years before 2000. And there was a point where he and his, now dearly departed mother were clandestinely roommates in his all-male residence hall at McMaster University right here in Hamilton, where I live. So yeah, this is a story of struggle paying off. Now, interestingly, the reason Barrie ended up in Hamilton at McMaster is he was going to study engineering back in the day as a teenager in the 1980s. Now, of course, the thing about engineering, speaking as someone who has an engineer in his family, is it requires, being obsessive about how things are put together. Let's make this 5% sleeker. Let's make this use 15% less electricity. Well, for Barrie Shepley, I guess the machine that enthralled him was the human body, which, led to him, pursuing, physical education studies and eventually into coaching and building up triathlon. And he co-founded Personal Best, his Toronto-based health and human performance business, which he and his spouse Karen Shepley and longtime friend Sheldon Prasad have had for over 30 years. So anyways, I guess we're really looking forward to doing an episode in the world of athletics. We've only had, I guess, one. Again, well, I guess we've had two. We had Mark Hebscher's book, The Greatest Athlete You've Never Heard of, back in the early days. And then last year, Perdita Felician, the hurdler, came on to talk about her memoir, My Mother's Daughter. But so this will be number 3. We got 3. We're on the podium now. And of course, triathlon. The beauty of that and all the other endurance sports is how they are relatively accessible. You just have to get outside. And throughout the book, Barrie Shepley talks about people from various different walks of life and athletic backgrounds. He convinced to go out there and just compete against yourself and look forward to grinding out those kilometers and getting in the pool or whatever, and look forward to that release of endorphins as just sit nagging on your couch for the rest of the night, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. He has taken on a wide range of clients across the gamut. So maybe at the end, Nate, I'll ask him, we'll give him our profiles and see if he'd take us on and turn us into a well-oiled machine that can tackle the water, cycling and running. Well, maybe not. Okay, so again, you mentioned his commentary. He's been a long-time commentator with CBC. Started in 2004 at Athens. I believe he's been in the booth for every triathlon since. He started with legendary play-by-play commentator Steve Armitage, and it's legendary gets thrown around a lot, but Steve Armitage really fits that bill. He recently retired, so shout out to Steve Armitage. And now I think he's been working alongside Signa Butler. He also commentates triathlon across the world. He has a funny story in his book about meeting a man in Japan whose job was to translate all of his English commentary into Japanese, which he found very astounding and was very impressed by, given he's off the cuff so much. So, in Canada, the triathlon is not what we would call a marquee sport. And because of that, you may not know a lot about Barrie unless you're really dialed in. But today we're going to learn about him and his accomplishments, what he's done for the sport, what he's seen, and why he loves it so much. So after the break, Barrie Shepley. Welcome, Barrie Shepley. How are you doing, sir?
Well, as the darkness gets happening earlier in the day, I'm finishing up coaching workouts in the dark. So that's never as a happy a time as in middle of June when the days are getting longer, but it's part of the life of being a coach.
And you're in Caledon right now, correct?
Yeah, just north of the Toronto airport. With all the traveling over the last 30 years, I was looking for something near an airport and lots of green space and open water to swim. So we found the perfect location in Caledon.
Yeah, you have a lot of airport tales in your book, Chasing Greatness, which is what we're going to talk about today. And I know it's been a long time since we were able to finally track you down and coordinate everything. So thanks for making the time, especially after training today, to talk with us.
No, I appreciate it. And, the book itself was such a fun project when you have 35 years to look back to, Olympians, to 75-year-olds who've set world records, to, people who lost 80 or 90 pounds. So it was a fun journey to just go back and catch up with some of those people. In some cases, maybe it's been a decade since I've been in touch with them.
When when you do so many different things like yourself, whether it's you're a commentator, you're a coach, you're an organizer. When you meet somebody quickly that's never met you, and there are going to be people that are listening to this podcast that may not know about you. What do you usually tell them first? That you're, what's the what's the order?
Well, my father still asks me when I come home at Christmas, "What is it that you do?" So I'm never that bummed out when relative strangers ask me the question. It was really fortuitous. There's various phrases that when you find what you love, you'll never work a day in your life, and that kind of thing. And as I was coming out of McMaster University in the mid '80s, I'd done some graduate research. I was coaching the university team. I had been started up with the sport of triathlon. I knew that I did not want to be in a box, doing the same thing every day. And so fortunately, my business partner, Sheldon Prasad, and my soon-to-be wife, Karen Hyland at the time, now Karen Shepley, the three of us literally jumped off a bridge with $2,500 in our pocket, and we're not sure that there was going to be water underneath that bridge. And it's been the greatest 30 plus years. We just hit our 32nd year, Sheldon and I and Karen, in being in business together. And our real objective was to take our knowledge of nutrition, of biomechanics, of injuries, our sort of fortuitous skill of understanding human psyche and inspiring people, and just creating an environment where projects from events to helping people train for silly things like marathons or bike trips or Ironman races, you name it, that we spent our last 30 plus years playing. Like literally, I never looked at my watch in 30 years to say, when is it 5 or 6 or 7 o'clock? And so, I consider that to be the greatest, journey ever. Right. And then to meet all these fantastic people who now, in some cases, their kids are coming to do training with us or training camp. So it's clear that we left some kind of positive impact on the parent when they're now 14 or 15 or 16-year-old kids are coming to clinics and camps and training with us.
So you're talking about when you're jumping off the proverbial bridge, you're talking about creating personal best in 1991. And there's also, we talked before we started recording about the C3 component. This kind of leads into some questions we had later on, but if you just want to give us a kind of a breakdown of what C3 is and in personal best, you talked about its formation, but maybe how they're different.
Yeah, so personal best was the actual thing that paid the bills over the years. And we did everything from run corporate wellness centers for some of the biggest companies that you can imagine in North America. So, the Bell Mobilities and the General Motors and the Manulifes of the world, we would have 2 or 3 of our staff right in their business, right in the building, doing everything from helping them do a spin class to, training for a 5K to losing weight to coming back from pregnancy and so forth. So we had the greatest fun staff whose job every day was to go in and make a positive impact on the lives of people in companies. So the corporate personal best was one of the biggest things that we did. And then the second part of personal best, more Sheldon, and myself were working with people who had kind of individual performance goals. So Sheldon has put at least a dozen people through into Olympic teams, and everything from sailing to boxing to you name it, figure skating. We've worked with Olympic athletes and helped them get on those Olympic teams for the last 30 years. And I've been a little bit more on the endurance side, and that's the marathons, the triathlons, the bike races, and adventure racing. So personal best was the thing that paid the bills. And along the way, we realized there were these fantastic athletes who had the motivation, who had the talent. What they did not have was the cash to buy an airline ticket to get to an event, or some piece of equipment that they needed, or a little bit of extra physiotherapy or massage therapy. So we created the nonprofit back in 1995 with a group of a dozen people who were businessmen and women who said, look, I get it. These kids, when you're already famous and you're Sidney Crosby, do you really need another $500 or an airline ticket? No, you don't. But when you're 17 and you need to get to national junior champs or to Pan Am juniors, because that's the stepping stone to make an Olympic team, you really do. And so people like Simon Whitfield and Kyle Jones and Andrew York and other Olympians that have come through our program in the last 30 years, it might have been an airline ticket, it might have been a piece of equipment. But when I reflect back and talk to them years later, there was that critical moment that these almost complete strangers came to my rescue, did a fundraiser, came to a silly golf tournament or a supper, or threw some $100 bills into a hat, and I was able to buy an airline ticket or get a couple of extra days in warm weather training before a big race for an athlete. And so the nonprofit really helped the athletes with their equipment and personal best, and Sheldon and Karen and I were the kind of coaching side of things to take care of the technical aspects.
Well, we're going to ask you about Simon a little later, and from what you were just saying, it reminds me of something when I had a chance to interview Simon not many years ago. I'd say about 7 or 8 years ago. He called it. He said, but before he was kind of high profile per se, he did something called credit card racing, which I'd never heard of before. Which
lots of them do.
Yeah, which you can explain what credit card racing is to our listeners.
Well, I mean, it is the highest ultimate pressure. And it was one of the reasons why I wanted to start C3, because I saw athletes who failed under credit card pressure, which is you need to get an airline ticket, or you need to get a piece of equipment, or you need a couple nights in a hotel. And the only way you're paying back that bill in 30 days without 25% interest rate is you had to get to the race and come on the podium, first or second or third. You get a flat tire, you eat a bad, street meat burrito, and don't finish the event. You are now going to be eating $1,000 airline ticket that you thought you could, pay off, and now you can't. And so, there were a few athletes who were incredibly special, like Simon, who, literally the dude was the king of pressure. He could manage it. It's one of the reasons why on his first big trip to the Olympics, the debut of the Olympics, he won. He won, major titles like Commonwealth Games and so forth. But for the average person, you can imagine you're standing there waiting for the gun to go off, and you know that there's only 3 or 4 or 5 paychecks. It's not like professional baseball, where if you sit inside the baseball diamond for the entire 9 innings and don't get asked to go out, you still are going home with your $11,000 paycheck at the end of the day. Amateur athletes are living on the edge, and it's tough. And so one of the things we wanted to do was reduce the pressure on some of those things. And there are a number of organizations around Canada that have done fantastic work similar to what we've done in a small grassroots area. But wherever you can contribute, whether it's equipment, whether it's buying an airline ticket or whatever, it takes the pressure off, so the athlete now can actually just go out and perform and not feel, oh my God, if I miss that's by a second, I can't pay the bills. And that's not a fun pressure to have.
Well, you know what, Barrie? We're going to go back to the beginning and ask you about basically your association with triathlon, and then Nate's going to jump in as well. I've hogged the airtime yet again. Let's start with your association with triathlon. It begins in the 1980s, and can you paint the picture of what the scene, and I think there was really no scene, was like in Canada at that time for the sport?
Yeah, so again, for the listeners, I mean, the very first triathlon, essentially was this Hawaii Ironman dozen idiots in 1978, just trying this thing, a dozen people in Honolulu, no road closures. You had a guy driving along in a car with a map, and that was 1978. And because of proximity of, kind of the United States to Canada, Canadians on the West Coast, particularly by the early 80s, had started to hear about the sport, and it was a swim and a bike and a run. And it was done because people who ran every day got injured, and they still get injured if they run every day. So the breaking up the workouts over different body parts over different days seemed to be a smart strategy. And so while the word triathlon came around, it really was cross-training. I swim a little bit, I'll bike a little bit, I'll run a little bit, maybe in the winter I cross-country ski a little bit. And I just happened to be literally coming along in the late 70s, early 80s. And when I tried to find the association, there was no Triathlon Canada, there was no Triathlon Ontario or Triathlon Quebec, whatever. And so I was running with a professor at McMaster University, and he convinced me to start up the association. He would give me a credit for one of my admin classes if I wrote the paper. So I wrote the paper, we took it to the government. And as often happens with governments, they're slow to act, and they didn't really act. They were, well, we'll get back to you. Well, 6 months goes by, no answer. And so on another run with the professor, now I'm at McMaster University, his name was Dr. Frank Hayden, we just decided, why not start our own association? So I put a call out to every triathlete, little kind of from Ottawa to Kingston to Windsor to Collingwood, Thunder Bay. We showed up in Burlington. And by the end of the 3-hour meeting, I have been elected as the president of Triathlon Ontario. I'm 21 years old. I'm living in Edwards Hall at McMaster University. And so the office for Triathlon Ontario was Edwards Hall. The telephone number for the hotline was my outgoing telephone line. And I was the president and at some point the coach. And as Triathlon Canada was starting to be formulated, its head office started out of British Columbia, I was logical, as Triathlon Ontario, to be a part of that board. And because of my real passion was coaching, I eventually became the national coach in the early 90s. And one of the biggest concerns that I had was that every sport that I look at, if you look at today, there's thousands and thousands of kids who play soccer or swim or hockey or tennis, whatever it is, and a few adults and elites at the top. Triathlon was completely opposite. There were 0 kids and tens of thousands of adults who were like coming into the sport every month, every year, right across the country. And so I came up with the idea of a program called Kids of Steel, and stealing from the idea of Iron Man, Kids of Steel. And so I literally got a company in downtown Toronto, naively convinced them to put up a check and to pay for some T-shirts and medals and kids' first summer of racing, and rented a van, and for a whole summer drove across the country to as many places as I could find who would get a swimming pool or a small lake. And that within 2 years, we had over 40 races across the country. But that very first summer, a very small town called Sharbot Lake outside of Kingston, it's a little cottage place with about 50 cottages. I convinced a person to help me put a race on there, and their next door neighbor in Kingston was a 12-year-old boy named Simon Whitfield. And so Simon came up to the cottage with his buddy, did his first triathlon with a hockey helmet on a mountain bike. And I could see that this kid had something special. I mean, you don't have to be very bright as a coach when you see somebody moving just beautifully. They just glide when they're running and so forth. And so Simon and his parents came to a dozen races over the next couple of years, brought him to training camps. And when he was just about to turn 16, he went, his father was an Australian, and he convinced his dad to let him go to Australia, to Sydney, to do his grade 11 and 12, all by himself, staying at a boys' boarding school with his parents living in Kingston. And I was happy and sad. Happy that this kid had this great opportunity, sad because Australia was the hub of the sport in the 90s. And I'm like, this kid's never coming home. And so he got over there. He learned the sport at another level. And by the mid-90s, triathlon was going to make its debut in Sydney. It had been selected as a brand new full medal sport in Sydney He's living 11 kilometers from the race course, and he has a dual passport. His dad was an Aussie, his mom's a Canadian. And so I'm like, dude is never coming home. He could be living in Sydney, training on Bondi Beach, getting ready for the Olympics down the street, or he could come back here where we have snow for 5 months of the year. But he called and said, look, I'm a Canadian. I feel I want to come back to Canada and compete for Canada. And like, it was the greatest thing that has ever happened to the sport in Canada for sure. He's, went to 4 Olympics, won the debut gold medal, won another medal in Beijing, dozens of titles. But more than just being a winning athlete, he was just this incredible ambassador for the sport. And so because of that, CBC decided, hey, let's cover this sport. This is a cool kid. And I happened to be lucky enough to start doing some commentary for them right off the bat. And so I've now been to 5 Olympics doing CBC coverage just because some kid in Sharbot Lake, did his first triathlon with a mountain bike helmet and I met him. I mean, that's really my fortuitous good luck.
And what was impressive about what Simon asked for, I guess, in the mid-90s when C3 isn't what it is today and when Own the Podium isn't around? What was impressive about what he asked for when we're trying to figure out what would he need to get to qualify for Sydney?
Yeah, he was so bright. Like you and I would say, show me the money. Like, you know what? Literally, he was driving a car with no back window and he'd have to start pumping the brakes 50 meters before the pool because he'd run into the side with no brake fluid. I'm thinking, dude's going to ask for cash. He's broke. He's not getting massages. He's got old equipment, but he didn't. He said, I need training partners. And I'm like, wow, what a mature young guy to be thinking about the big picture. You know what? I can always find a bike. I can always, figure out an airline ticket or something, but I need daily training partners. And so I moved to Victoria, British Columbia in the late 90s. I had to get all my credentials to be accredited to go to the Olympics. And I said to Simon, let me get some bodies here to help you. And he made me a bet that I couldn't get 5 athletes or 6 athletes, I forget what the number was, to move to Victoria. And so I called Corner Brook, Quebec, right across Ontario, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, right across the country, Alberta. And within a matter of about 2.5 weeks, I had over 24 athletes who wanted to move to Victoria to train with Simon and myself. And they all had the same problem. They owed $14,000, $15,000, $18,000 of student loans, and they couldn't afford to move out there and have no place to live and have to pay for rent. So Simon and I and a couple of other athletes went on a little rampage for about 3 nights, and we dropped off 1,000 flyers around Sandage Pool, if anyone's been out to Victoria where the Commonwealth Games pool is. And within a matter of about 8 days, I had 24 families who said, look, I've got a granny flat. My kids are gone. They've moved out of the house. There's a basement, apartment. And all of these athletes, for absolutely free, had a new home, a new family. And I tell the story in the book. One day, I literally couldn't afford to do anything other than bring my mountain bike out. And I'm living in residence with 17-year-olds. And I'm riding myself to the swimming pool in a cold, damp, February raining morning. And I see a couple of my athletes driving by in SUVs from the family that they're living with. I'm going, who's got a better deal here? But these families were spectacular. And in many cases, they've stayed on as supporters of triathlon 25 years later. But that was this, odd family. We borrowed pool time because we had no budget. So I went looking at the swimming pool, and this thing is sitting there every day for about 2 hours, and 10-lane, 50-meter pool with nobody in it in the middle of the day, and convinced them to let me have a couple lanes of swimming pool for free. So our whole national program, in 98, 99, going into 2000, was a volunteer coach, no high performance budget for pool or anything else. And out of that, you can imagine where my mind was blown when September of 2000, this kid wins the gold medal against the Americans who've got a $1.5 million a year budget, and the Germans with a $2 million budget, and the Aussies who, wanted him to stay there, and who comes up with the gold medal, but this kid who the only thing he asked for was training partners.
And how much does that whole arc, maybe reflect something you write early in the book, which is, what I've learned over the past 40 years is that sole purpose comes from trusting your gut?
Yeah, you know what? I mean, I never was motivated by money, and still not today. And so I think that I was fortunate that I just found that I had, it's interesting. I talk about this in the book. If I was just 2% better an athlete, I would have said, screw all this. I'm going to try to be the athlete and forget all this other hard work behind the scenes for the next 45 years of my life. But pretty quickly, I realized that bowling was not in the Olympics, and I desperately wanted to go to the games. And I tell the story of, I'm working at Chrysler, making bands in July of 1984, and all of the cafeteria is transfixed watching the television as Alex Baumann, this kid from Sudbury, beats every German, every American, every Aussie to win the IM Olympic gold medal in swimming. And that moment is the most addictive thing I've ever had, because I looked around at people who never said boo to each other in the cafeteria for the entire summer, and yet they're hugging each other because a Canadian kid with a maple leaf on his pec has just beaten everyone in the world. And that was this kind of crazy drug that I wanted desperately, and wanted it initially for me. And when I realized that bowling is not in the Olympics, and I'm not 6'9", and I don't have 100-mile-an-hour, fastball, I was going to be doing it on the other side of the curve. And so I quickly realized that my strength was helping others. It wasn't going to happen myself as an elite athlete. And so I was at peace with that right from the very beginning. And then it was, once that came to grips, it's okay, what can I and my friends and my family and my business partner, what can we do to help Canadians, even though we don't have the budget and the population and the weather in many cases? But if we're a little more creative and a little harder working, maybe we can, beat some of the big programs. And I remember this one moment will stay with me forever. We're in Japan. All the other Americans flew over a week in advance to get over jet lag and heat acclimatization. And Simon and I and a couple of the other boys got in literally the morning before. So, we've got 20 hours and we're racing. Their muscles are stiff. We weren't on first class seats in the back of the airplane. And I walk by the Americans' door, and it's open, and they've got 3 tables of guys getting massages in their room. We have no massage therapy. We haven't been there for a week. And it pissed me off so badly that I literally went down the street. I found we're in Japan, found a Japanese guy who had a massage place. He didn't speak English, but I'm drawing little stick figures, and he wanted my jacket and $100 American. And he came back to the room and did massages on all of our athletes. I mean, that's how, unsophisticated, but on the other side, you're not going to beat us. We're going to find solutions, even though we're not overly financed. And that really spoke to a lot of Simon's career. I mean, he didn't necessarily need to be in the richest, best pool, in the biggest locations. And in many cases, he and other athletes across the country, the Adam Vancouverians, almost take a bit of pride of I'm going to do this the kind of dirty way. I'm not going to have all the best of everything, because that's going to keep me hungry.
Yeah, a lot of these experiences, I don't know if that one was in the book, but yeah, I mean, definitely the idea of bootstrapping is a term we talked about off the top before we started talking to you, which is associated with tech startups really. But bootstrapping is all about that.
Totally.
You as a grad student, you spent time in labs, and then you also, like Nate asked you, you have statements like, your sole purpose comes from trusting your gut. So I wanted to ask you about that balance, because I mean, it's a loose connection, but we interview a lot of people in hockey and baseball and football, and there's the analytics talk and the eye test, and I wanted to know how that factors into triathlon. When you say, you got to trust your gut, but you've also been in a lab, how does that balance tie into what you do for a living in training these high performance athletes?
Well, I think it would be a mistake silly not to use science as much as you possibly can. And so, whether it's lactate testing or VO2 max, or, now we can do things with MRIs and other things to look at fiber typing and muscle fibers, that kind of thing. So there is science, and it's silly not to use that science. Absolutely, no question about it. But I think if you take a look, some of the greatest coaches I've ever met, they all that science ultimately did was validated what they believed and knew, 4 or 5 or 6 years before some piece of equipment could come along and tell you why they felt that way. So I think there's a certain keen eye that coaches who've been around for a very long time, and smart coaches, I think, use the balance of the two. You look at analytics and metrics and things that can work, from heart rates to, temperatures. One athlete sweats at a higher concentration and therefore they need more electrolytes in their drink. There's all of that science, which would be absolutely silly not to optimize and to maximize. But I think when you get to that last piece of the pie, you need to kind of look at an athlete and understand, will this athlete be able to endure the kinds of tough mental aspects that highest performance of sport are? And I can show you 50 athletes whose data were equal to Simon and superior in some cases. And yet they never made it, because when it came to that hunger factor, when it came to that kind of just being a little bit, like how to look at another athlete's weakness and take advantage of it. I mean, there's little tiny nuances when you're at the highest level. And that's what makes the Sidney Crosbys and, the Wayne Gretzkys and the Steve Nashes. In most cases, you can't physiologically say that Sidney Crosby or Wayne Gretzky, certainly Wayne Gretzky, was not physiologically different than anybody else in the NHL. And, they just weren't. But there was a combination of psychological, of emotional, of thirst, of hunger. And when you put that mixture together, and as an elite coach, I see it incredibly rare, You'll see a kid who has the burning desire and they just don't have the goods physiologically, or they get injured on a regular basis and they just can't, they just don't have the capacity to do the workload. Or if they've got, the physiological body, they don't have the heart and desire to kind of do that tough thing that it takes. So the reason there are so few, GOATs and champions are that you need the mixture of all of those things. So when a Simon comes along, I knew at an early age that this kid had a incredible mixture of physiological skills, of cocky enough, of, piss other people off enough, of confidence in himself enough, that all those things would come together when no one else could be standing holding your hand, when you're in game 7 of a baseball game or the gun going off at Olympic Games finals. I mean, you got to have the goods. Your mom and your dad and your coach and nobody else can do it. You've got to kind of be, have all the goods. Now, we can help you along that journey, but at the end of the day, you're the one who's going to have to perform.
Mm-hmm. Now, one person who was hungry to build acceptance of triathlon was your friend, the late, great Les McDonald. For people who might not know the name and the legend, what did he bring to the table, which was probably literally his kitchen table in terms of building the sport?
Yeah, no person in my life has made a bigger impact on me personally in sport, number one, on impacting more endurance athletes around the world, hands down, will never be changed. And so Les McDonald had moved from the UK, raised by his grandmother, hardworking, moved to Vancouver, and was an electrician, but a phenomenal athlete. He had been a boxer, he'd been a skier, he'd worked with Nancy Green, the skier out in BC in the 60s. And then he got involved in this sport of triathlon, and very quickly he won the Ironman in his age category 5 straight years. So he was a fantastic athlete, but he had this vision of getting triathlon into the Olympic Games. And that became his priority on every single thing he did. So he was the Triathlon Canada president that I worked under when I was one of the vice presidents and the coaches. But one of the things that he did was he looked around the world, and the world looked at him, and he said, look, I'm going to get us in the Olympics. And you can imagine, here is rugby, here is tennis, here is golf that are 30, 40, 50 years ahead in paid staff around the world. They're going to kick triathlon's butt getting into the Olympics. Well, guess what? None of them got in Sydney. It was triathlon because of one guy who was relentless and who had a great story, because part of his story was, we have this absolute equality sport. Unlike many sports still today, men and women did the exact same distance. They got the exact same prize money. They went on the exact same course. There was nothing, inferior in the female experience compared to the male experience. And Antonio Samaraj, the Spanish IOC president, looked at the sport, said we got to keep evolving. We need stuff that's exciting for television so young people will keep watching. We love the fact that it had equality, that it had prize money for men and women, that it was television spectator friendly. And so between the friendship of Les McDonald, the IOC president, in 1993, it was declared Sydney will be the next Olympic Games in 2000, and triathlon and taekwondo were both coming in to those Sydney Olympic Games. And so Les was the president for 20 plus years. He drove it through, international television, Olympic Games. And the second that it got into the Olympics, selected in 93, dozens of federations around the world started to fund their athletes and fund coaches and fund races in their countries. So, in the 80s, Italy and Portugal and none of these places, Sweden, were in the sport. Now they're creating world champions. Little Norway creating the Olympic gold medalist in the last Olympic Games. Bermuda, the female Olympic champion. All of that, 100%, is a 70-year-old Canadian man from North Vancouver who sadly passed a couple of years ago. But he literally drove it into the Olympics. He understood the importance of television. He understood that it was the right moment for equality for men and women. And at the very first World Championships, the French government, who was hosting the Worlds, had tried to renege and only were going to have prize money for the men and not the women. And so Les went to the men, the elite men who were racing, and said, look, guys, I need you to all say you're not going to race. We're a sport that believes women are 100% equal to you guys, and they deserve equal prize money, and I expect you to not race. And so the men backed Les's request, and the French government backed down and gave equal prize money to the women. And from that day onward, men and women at every race, including the Hawaii Ironman that I was just at a week ago, give absolute equality in prize money for men and women. And you don't see that, for example, the women have been fighting it in soccer and basketball and other sports, but triathlon, since the 90s have had absolute equality. And that's because of this Les McDonald. So he carried my butt around the world. There's no way I get these international commentary gigs in the 90s and early 2000s if he isn't the guy. But he believed in me, he gave me a chance. And then once I had mastered my skills, other countries around the world and commentating opportunities kept coming up because I had kind of been in early. I knew the athletes, I'd had some skills I developed. And so I 100% owe that to Les McDonald for sure.
It's just talking about the pay equity and the equal treatment across the board. Obviously, that's been big. That was a big theme throughout the last, I think, 2 Olympics in Beijing, the Winter Games, and prior to that in Tokyo. I want to ask you about Sylvain Pontus and a female from Canada, and we all know Simon Whitfield. But what did she do for the sport in Canada, and could you explain her background?
Yeah, well, so you can picture the Ironman, as I said, started in 1978 in Hawaii. That was 2.4 mile swim, 112 mile bike ride, 26 mile run. And these twin sisters, Sylviane and Patricia Pontus, were from Quebec. They were winning all of these races, and they went to that very first World Championships I talked about. And by the time we get into 1983 and 84, they have literally crossed the line and won the Hawaii Ironman. Sylviane won it 2 years in a row. Her sister was second to her. And so here's one of the biggest races in the world on ABC Wild World of Sports. And these Canadian women, beautiful twin sisters from Quebec, are winning the biggest race in the world in the 80s. And so they were putting us on the map. And for many, many years after that, people like Lori Bowden and Lisa Bentley and Heather Fior and Peter Reed went on to win the Hawaii Ironman 1 and 2 and 3 times in some cases. But, they had kind of like a godmother ahead of them who was winning that race, showing that a Canadian from snowy little country can go to Hawaii in the heat and race the Americans, the Aussies, and the Germans and the Brits and beat them all. And they were fantastic role models for Canada in those early years. I had them on my first national teams that I coached, and we were incredibly fortunate that they just happened to be ahead of their time. They eventually went back to Quebec, and I think they ran some of Celine Dion's restaurants for her as after they retired from triathlon, but they still are iconic. When I was in Hawaii last week, they still have these big posters up of every winner who has ever won the race. And, there were 5 or 6 Canadian posters up, which I always take great pride as I'm walking through there, because there's only a half dozen countries that have ever had an athlete that won the Hawaii Ironman, and Canada's had 5 or 6.
I just want to go back a little bit, and thank you for explaining who she is, because I learned about her through your book, and then going on the Triathlon Canada website, the governing body here. So obviously, to get the sport to the Olympics, there needed to be the formation of an international body, which was the ITU in 1989. So where did Triathlon Canada proceed? Did it precede that? When was Triathlon
we were
Canada?
A couple years. So Triathlon Ontario happened first, and then within 12 months, Triathlon Canada had been formed, and I'm on that board with this hardworking, just psychotically driven Les McDonald. And ironically, the Ironman ties into the formation of the International Triathlon Union, because there was no place in the world that all these triathletes were, kind of getting together and making rules and deciding things. The only time back in the 80s that there was ever a real stimulus or density of triathletes was at the Hawaii Ironman. So Les was there, he raced, he won his age category, and he put out a challenge to all of these athletes, to get a representative or two from their country to come to the first ever formation of the international body. And so in 1988, they made this decision. Next year, in after the Hawaii Ironman, we're all going to meet a few months later in Avignon, France. And so in 1989, the ITU was formed. This Canadian Les McDonald became the president. He for a period of time remained president of Triathlon Canada and the International Triathlon Union, but soon there was just too much work to be done on the international body, and some more people stepped forward in Canada and took on that national role as president. But he maintained that role, and his real claim to fame on many levels, but it'll be the Olympics, because now kids in countries are getting funded coaches, funded support, some equipment, some camps, and so forth that would never have happened had it not been for Les. And he also had this incredible eye, and his eye said to him, look, a swimming pool is a swimming pool anywhere in the world. Michael Phelps, you don't know Michael Phelps in Beijing, or he's in Sydney, or he's in wherever. You just know he's a dude in a 50-meter pool tearing it up. So you don't really get to see the country. But in a triathlon, you're outside. And that very first Olympic triathlon, you saw them dive in right in front of the Opera House and swim, right in the bay there. And then they're out riding through Macquarie Street and through the parks and downtown Sydney. The Opera House is there. The bridge is in the backdrop. The helicopters are all over. 500,000 people are on the streets. It literally was the postcard to show off Sydney. And it was not by, bad luck. I mean, the first morning was women's triathlon, started off the Olympic Games. So you got to see the country in the first 15 minutes of the 2000 Olympic Games. And that second morning, an unknown kid, Simon Whitfield, wins the gold medal. And so, we were on, like, the sport just went right through the kind of the ozone immediately, because we had huge crowds. They were free for 450,000 people because you're out on the street. So it was only the people who paid for tickets sitting in front of the Opera House and the big screen. But otherwise, 500,000 people got to see a free Olympic sport in downtown Sydney. And the rest of the world, 2 billion people, got to watch it on TV. So we made an impact from second one. And we were fortunate, Dick Pound, who was an IOC vice president, Canadian, is handing out a medal to a Canadian athlete. Like, how cool is that?
Well, I'm glad you bring up Sydney again, because you mentioned the women's race. So everyone remembers Simon, especially in Canada. But the women's race was first, and there's a huge contrast in how that played out for this country. So could you briefly explain what transpired for Canadian athletes in that women's triathlon that kind of, maybe it was a bit rough, let's say.
Oh, so it was totally rough. And you can imagine, I'm a brand new coach. I have no mentor coach. No one's ever been there to kind of mentor me. I've had this vision since 1984 of Alex Baumann winning the gold medal and the anthem, and I naively was going into that first morning dreaming about hearing the Canadian anthem. And we had two athletes particularly. One was Carol Montgomery, who was ranked number 2 in the world, so a legitimate chance to win the gold medal at the Olympic Games. And she had done something that had never been done before or since. And that was she made 2 Olympic Games sports at the same Olympic Games. So she was on the 10,000 meter track team where she had run 32 minutes for 10K. And she was also on the triathlon team where she was, favored to win a medal, if not the gold medal. And we had a world-class athlete named Sharon Donnelly, who was a Royal Military graduate, had been the Pan Am Games champion the year before. So we're going in there with these 2 women particularly who legitimately could medal and maybe win the whole thing. And so I am 6 inches off the ground that morning because I can feel 1984 Alex Baumann anthem coming at me. And within less than the 1,500 meter swim takes 18 minutes. And within a lap and a half into the 40-kilometer bike ride, Carol catches a wheel of another athlete, goes down, breaks her arm, is now out of the triathlon and the 10,000 meters. And within another lap, Sharon Donnelly goes down in a crash. And so our 2 best athletes are in the hospital. I am not hearing an anthem. I've got parents who are crying, media who are asking me questions about how and why. I wasn't ready for that kind of, just getting drilled by people coming at me. And it was, oh my God. And so by the time I get back to the residence with Simon, who was my roommate, I look like a ghost. And it was Simon calming me down. He had watched the race on TV. He knew the disappointment of the girls, the broken bones. And he just said, look, I'm ready. Don't worry about it. We'll get this job done tomorrow. And I'm like, here's a kid who's, 8 or 9 years younger than me. We both were young, both inexperienced, but he was the one who calmed me down. And, the next day he was the guy who got the job done.
Yeah, the first ever male triathlete is a gold medalist from Canada named Simon Whitfield, who you saw in Sharbot Lake. But here's the thing, maybe it's the negative press talking here, but I'm gonna ask you. I mean, if you look, he's the only guy who's won any medals so far across the board. There's 2 medals. There's gold and a silver in 08.
Yeah.
How do you view that? Do you feel like we should have more as a country? Do you feel like more is coming? How do you see that?
So the short answer to that is yes and no. I mean, if your viewers, listeners, go and take a look, Canada has an absolutely insane record of winning a medal, sometimes gold, but a medal at the first time a sport debuts at the Olympic Games. Beach volleyball, 1996, bronze medal. Women's mountain biking, Atlanta, medal. Trampoline, medal, and I can keep going. Like it's crazy, our success rate the first time a sport debuts. By the time we get to the 2nd or 3rd or 4th Olympic cycle, what I'm seeing is 2 or 3 things working against us. Other countries with larger populations putting a lot more money and resources into their athletes. And now suddenly you're seeing a population 20 times your size who have got 6 coaches and a lot more funds. And now there's a whole bunch more people fighting out for that trampoline medal or that mountain bike medal or whatever. So I'm not making excuses by any stretch, but it's odd that when it's at the beginning and everybody's kind of on almost equal footing or close to equal footing, we're kicking some ass. When we get out there a little bit later on. So Own the Podium came along at a certain moment because of the lack of success in our Winter Olympics and our Summer Olympics when we hosted. So after all of those, Montreal and Calgary, we didn't want to go to Whistler and have a 3rd Olympics without a gold medal because we were the only country that had ever hosted and not got a gold medal when we hosted. So the massive success in Vancouver Whistler was one part we were maturing as a country, one part we are theoretically better suited for Winter Olympic sports, and one part we finally put freaking enough money into the sport where athletes had better equipment, better coaches, more money for training camps, and it showed up. We led the medal count in Whistler, Vancouver in 2010. The disappointment for me in triathlon is in many ways what occurred in those early days, honestly, was not systematic development of Simon Whitfield. You know, like if Simon Whitfield was one of 50 Sidney Crosbys coming down the pipe, and you knew 2 years later there was another Sidney Crosby and another Sidney Crosby and another Sidney Crosby. We didn't have the funds. I was an unfinanced, unpaid coach. And so by the time we kind of get into early 2000s, you know, we've got a coach or two that came after me that was paid, but we really didn't have a system of developing 20 little Simons and Carols so that, you know, 4 or 5 of them matured into your top level athlete, whether that's speed skating, swimming, or whatever. So triathlon is still reeling as we speak to develop that system of having, you know, 100 good juniors and then 20 good 23 and unders and then 6 good elites, of which 2 are going to maybe have a chance at a medal. Because Simon was a weirdo, one-off, freak of nature. You know, if I'd not gone to Sharbot Lake, the kid would have been playing 3 other sports at a very high level, but none of them at the Olympics. I mean, he was just a very good soccer player, a very good basketball player, a great little track runner. And I still remember at the closing ceremonies, I mean, here we go into the Sydney Olympics. Nobody knows Simon, literally doesn't know Simon. He doesn't go to the opening ceremonies because he's competing in 36 hours and wants to save his energy, wins the gold medal, carries the flag into the closing ceremonies as Canada's rep. And I can still picture this if it was yesterday. After he carries the flag in, you're all kind of on the infield, and it's now chaos. People are having fun and trading jackets and doing whatever as kind of speeches are occurring. And some Spanish kid had brought his soccer ball onto the field. He was a Olympic soccer player for Spain. And he's like heading the ball up and down off his knee. And Simon sees it, and the ball rolls towards Simon, and he flips it up from his foot onto his head, onto his knee. And him and this kid, who they don't speak the same languages, and this guy would have no idea that the guy who's bouncing a ball back and forth off his head to him has just won the gold medal in triathlon, not in soccer. That, you know, that's who Simon was. He was a very good athlete, and you need a system to reproduce athletes, not just get lucky every 25 years that one Clara Hughes or one, you know, Adam Van Kouveren comes along. You need a system.
Yeah, and how well is that understood? Maybe among the media, among the general public, maybe even among, like, you know, top sports executives in Canada, because I always try to stress that with friends around the Olympics. It's not about having one. It's about, like you said, having 6 good people, because just in case someone's off that day, or, you know, someone else knows a team can pick them up, even if it's the sport as individual.
Well, almost any of the sports that are having success have a system and a feeder system. You know, swimming, take a look. We've seen, you know, McIntosh and these other kids coming along for 4 or 5 years. So it's not a surprise right now that we're being incredibly successful in the swimming pool. And we saw our young female soccer players, you know, coming along 6, 8, 9 years ago. Ashley Lawrence lives in my town, and I followed her career, you know, all the way along as part of the women's gold medal soccer team. So you need to have depth. And I think every federation is recognizing that within the country. The challenge, you know, and it's a massive challenge, is that I think we need to have a serious, in my estimation, as a 35, you know, years of coaching plus, I don't believe we're in the right place right now as a country, because I don't think that there are enough kids who are just physically active. So I take it back, like, I mean, all of Simon's magic happened in grade school and early high school, but grade school and early high school playing games. You ask him why he's successful, because 3 hours a day he was out back with friends playing games, et cetera. So I think we need to get more kids, you know, not all their hours spent in organized coaches on top of you with whistles and rules and all the other stuff. They need to learn how their body moves and learn competitive spirit, and, you know, literally just open the doors and let the YMCA, you know, 3-on-3 basketball games happen and that kind of stuff. Yes, you will start to move kids into programs with some coaches and some instruction and some that kind of stuff. But so in my estimation, there aren't enough kids physically moving, number one. It disgusts me when I see the kind of professionalization of youth sport and $10,000 and $15,000 and $20,000 of, you know, cost to join some of these leagues and extra this and extra that. And so some great athletes are just literally being priced out of ever being able to participate in sport. And, some of the sports that we most care about, like ice hockey, I still play hockey. I'm a goaltender. Some of the prices are just putting kids, out of sport. So I think we need more kids physically active. I was just retired as the chairman of the Coaching Association of Ontario. Coaches, in my mind, are, it goes in the hierarchy for me, parent, teacher, coach. And we need to just give more and more respect and resources so that coaches can be out there on weekends and keeping it fun and not making everything have to turn into, massive big tournaments, et cetera. Because most of Simon's success and other kids that I've seen have come from just being able to have more, that 10,000 hours they talk about, whether it's accurate or not, it still is accurate in terms of the fact that your body did this stuff enough times, playing around on an outside pond where nobody's able to get the puck off your stick, and down the road, you're that dude who has some magic on a hockey stick. So I'm a fan of let as many kids be active. Don't fight it out for, I still see federations in this country fighting out to own athletes instead of saying, look, we just want you to be active. If you would be a better water polo player than a swimmer, or one of the places that we end up picking up athletes many cases are when swimming has lost, burnt out a kid. And I'm now taking an ex-swimmer and getting them into the sport because swimming is such an important part of triathlon. So I think the federations in the country need to be much more sharing and just care that a kid is still active. And I say if a kid is not active at 21 or 22, then you have failed as a federation and as a sport. If they're not doing this, as they're graduating college and enjoying being active as a whatever that sport may be, then you have failed in my estimation.
Mm-hmm. And one athlete, Barrie, that we did want to ask about that you talk about in the book, and she's right at that age as a junior athlete, Kira Gupta Baltazar. What's her potential and what's the story on her? I see she's running cross country in the U.S. college system and winning races.
Yeah, no, you know what? She was another Simon who knew what she wanted well before anyone else did. She had swam with Penny Alisiak and all of these great swimmers, and she looked at her hands and her feet and said, I'm putting the 30 hours of training in, but I can't move as much water as the 5'9", 5'10", 6-foot girl can move. I'm motivated, but I can't do that. And I want to go to the Olympic Games. So she literally tracked me down. I can still picture standing out on a pathway with her and her father one, Sunday morning, talking about what was possible. And so I mapped out a process for them if they were interested. And probably 8 times out of 10, when you map out something, the family disappears and you never see them again, because it means tomorrow you got to be at doing something outside your comfort zone that you haven't been doing for the last 5 or 6 years. Kira and her mom and dad and one particular uncle, they all formed a team in terms of helping her. Somebody would drive because she was only 14 and couldn't drive to work out. So somebody was picking her up, someone was dropping her off. But we had an entire family that backed her. And between, my 35 years of how to speed the process up of teaching a young athlete who didn't know how to ride a bicycle. And one of the coolest things that we ever did, and I mean, it'll sound ridiculous to the listener, but it's dividends paid 20 times over. Her uncle, who traveled a lot, had 1 million frequent flyer miles, said, look, I don't know anything about sport, but I'd love to help. What can I do? So I knew he traveled a lot. I said, I need you to buy 2 airline tickets to Copenhagen, one for your niece and one for another 16-year-old girl, for the two of them to come with one of the moms, sit in the grandstands for 3 days and watch the World Triathlon Championships, so that when I'm describing to her why she has to use her great swimming and be out of the water in the first 3 and transition quick onto the bike, she'll understand what we're talking about. And I thought for sure he would say that I'm not spending $800 on an airline ticket to send a 14-year-old girl to Copenhagen to watch a race. Well, he did. A year later, she was racing at the World Junior Championships in the Gold Coast. She's gone to every World Junior Champs that she was eligible for. Last year, she won the NCAA, best women's triathlete in America in college. And she just won a cross-country race in the States on the weekend as well. So, she is on her way. But, again, it's a long journey. And one of the things that she and her family and I all sat down and talked about, Paris is probably a little early for her, not a completely off the charts, but, trying to be a full-on college student and trying to train for the Olympic Games at the same time is not an easy thing. So in all likelihood, she'll gain as much experience as she can between now and Paris. It's probably a longer shot, but not impossible. But she'll be graduated and ready for the LA Olympics in 2028. And, she'll be the right age, the right experience, mature, got a degree, all of that kind of stuff. So it takes great pride for me knowing that these same volunteers that I talked about who've raised money, have helped, drive her bike to races and, there to make sure that she was getting as much early learning as she possibly could. And so she literally went from watching these great swimmers get away from her to, winning the NCAA triathlon championships in less than 4 years.
Mm.
For the sake of time, I know there are a couple of questions I wanted to ask, but I think we'll go right towards, because we've had you on for about an hour now, and thank you for giving us this much time. I'm assuming you'll be in Paris as the commentator again for CBC, and it'll be very scenic there, and you'll probably be working alongside Signa Butler, I believe, right?
Well, you know what? I learned a long time ago in the universe never to assume anything. You go back to zero the day after everything ends, and you work your ass off and hope you've impressed enough people with your work ethic. So I would love to be in Paris. I mean, we've been there for races over the last 20 years, but Paris will do a brilliant job of hosting the Olympics. And in the sport of triathlon, they've got 3 or 4 now of the best triathletes in the world. So, it's going to show as a phenomenal sport in Paris for sure.
Well, here's my question. I've thought of a number of ways to ask this, but I guess the first way is I was going to just give you like a breakdown of myself and Nate as a person, as a potential client, to see what you would look for and what you would, if you, I guess I'll just boil it down to this. Have you ever refused a client no matter how much money they would pay you?
No, not at all. Let me tell you just a really fast, interesting story. So if I think about, let's say, a marathon or a triathlon or the Ironman, I had a 61-year-old guy who could not put his face in the water, who did not own a bike, whose knees were a bit sore because he played college football 45 years before. And his son, who was 30 years of age, was coming to do an Ironman with me. And Dad cornered me and said, look, this would be like the dream to do an Ironman with my son. Is it possible? And I didn't know he couldn't swim. I didn't know anything about his bad knees. All I needed to do was spend about 20 minutes to understand, why would he want to do this? I mean, anything that you have to get up in the morning and do, whether it's go and do a weight workout or get into the water or whatever the sport might be, there's a certain amount of repetitiveness. And when you know your why are you doing this? I want to do it with my son. I've always dreamed about this. I saw it on television. I'm trying to lose 50 pounds to change my blood pressure, whatever the why is. If it's important enough to you, then I guarantee you I will get you through. And that guy, that was January of 2003 that we had the little supper. And in July, 7 months later, he crossed the finish line of Ironman Klagenfurt in Austria, and that's 2.4 mile swim, 112 mile bike ride, 26 mile run. He went on to do another Ironman a few years later and run a marathon, go to Boston. But this was a guy who was not an athlete for 25 years. So I never say never to anyone. I always say, let's sit down and ask the why. And is this something that we could do over 2 or 3 years? Or look, I've got 1 year before I'm going back to do my PhD or before my wife and I are going to have kids. There's 1,000 reasons why someone says it's got to happen in this next 12 months. And so literally we've got a 95 or 96% success rate in there because the first priority is it has to be fun. The second priority is I have to keep you injury free. And then we'll figure out how fast we get you there. I can guarantee you, Neil, you will not be winning the Ironman World Championships. But if you said, I wanted to do that, I would guarantee you I could get you across the finishing line in under the midnight hour.
Nate, there's hope for us to become high-performance athletes still, and not just talk to people about their books about being high-performance
I didn't say high performance. I said I would get you across the finish line.
Yeah, you might have to drag us across it.
It's all good.
That still counts.
I love it. Well, you know what, Barrie? Thanks for giving us so much time this evening. And I know the weather out there in Caledon is nothing like it was in Hawaii, so... you know, you got to get out there and train again tomorrow in this weather. I'm sure you got to prepare for it. So thank you again.
Listen, I appreciate it. And, you know, the book was just an amalgamation of these incredible people that I was lucky enough to meet and in a few cases inspire. And I've been getting some feedback from those who have read the book, and it's inspired some people to try their own things or whatever. So for me, that's the win all the way along. And that's really what the book was about.
Yeah, we enjoyed reading it, and we'll provide some links as to where you can listen to this podcast and buy the book. So
thank you so much, guys. I appreciate it. Looking forward to seeing you guys next year's Ironman.
Thanks, Barrie.